Alright, this is our first section of our last unit. This is where we're going to be going over some things with civil rights. The main focus will actually be with African Americans and the civil rights movement, but it will also include parts here for feminism, other movements in the 60s and 70s, as well as the conservative reaction that occurred after it. Now with our state standards, you will notice, and this is where you'll notice also like compare nonviolent and violent approaches utilized to achieve civil rights, key figures in the movements that you have in here. Also, again, where if you saw on there, where the other movements combined with it. For the bracketing dates, there is no one bracketing date for this because this even goes up to modern day for a lot of things. But we're basically trying to look at things post World War II. But even with that, we kind of start back in for both the women's rights and the for African Americans. A lot of their civil rights movement, you can go back to the executive order that was made during World War II that made it where anybody working in wartime industries got equal pay for their job. So they were treated by equals after the threat on Washington March that Philip Randolph had done. Jackie Robinson in baseball. I know I go a little bit more into this in class, but this is the biggest sport, and baseball as well as the military were great examples of it. Didn't matter who your dad was or your skin color, it was based on ability. And Jackie Robinson, who may not have even been the best player in the Negro Leagues at that time, but what he had to overcome mentally with balls being thrown at his head, high spikes, everything else, but then proved that not only was he capable, but one heck of a baseball player, and won over his teammates and as well as many fans that we would have. Now the case that you need to know, and this is where we have the Supreme Court making policy, is Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. It was a mixture of cases, 5 cases that were brought together. The key thing is it will overturn Plessy versus Ferguson from 1896. What they said is that the separate facilities were inherently unequal. Where Plessy had said separate but equal, in Brown they said they can't be equal. The Chief Justice is Earl Warren, which you're going to see him on multiple cases that we're going to see here. And Thurgood Marshall will be leading the NAACP in the arguments of this case. Later on, he'll be our first African American Supreme Court Justice. Now, one flaw to this was, it said that schools were to end segregation with all deliberate speed. So they did not give a timeline for it. So here in Citrus County, it was a decade and a half later before they will start obeying what Brown versus Board of Education was. Brown versus Board of Education, as well as the Civil Rights, is all based on the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause. So we go back to our very first unit in Reconstruction when the 14th Amendment was passed here. But the idea you cannot discriminate someone based on race, creed, or color. Brown versus Board and Plessy are usually handcuffed together. When you have one, and those for the others that you have. I point this out. This is where for a lot of Southerners, they were not taught about the Civil War. In this case, you see the War for Southern Independence. My father, who went to a segregated school in Orlando, Florida, he had learned about the War of Northern Aggression here. And why I point this out is for a lot of white Southerners, as changes were being made there, and what ultimately will happen is in the South, you're going to have to decide what side of history you're on. Because a lot of them, yes, they grew up where they were taught one thing, but then, and this is where for TV and other aspects of society there, where are you going to be when it comes for history? Now for nonviolent protests, this is where a lot of people say civil rights start with Rosa Parks, but as we saw, no, it started before then. But what Rosa Parks did when she will go and as a small petite woman who does not give up her seat there, it will start then in Montgomery to bus boycott, which Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. will come. He will organize it. This will be one of his first big things that he has. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference and black churches will get involved. And this is where it's a nonviolent using a boycott. Now, boycott is where you don't purchase something. In this case, they're not riding on the buses. It sounds okay, yeah, they didn't ride the buses. This is a major thing that went on for months, that people had to go and they had to make sure that maybe you had to leave for work 2 hours early or something because you're carpooling and what they gave up. But ultimately what happened was the city of Montgomery had to change their law because the private company that ran the bus system was not making money. And so this is an example of passive resistance there, or nonviolent protest, which is what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is going to be famous for. Another way of a passive resistance is a sit-in here. And Greensboro sit-in with North Carolina A&T students that were sitting at the Woolworth lunch counter. What happens with the sit-in is people that are there, they're not being served, they're arrested. Then other people take their place and they're arrested. Ultimately, the business is not going to make money if it's not going to serve them. Your jails are filled up with people that are arrested for sitting in a place. And so this is part. Are you willing to get arrested? Maybe spend a few days in jail there for what you believe. And this is where we're going to have sit-ins. And that's a great example, again, of another passive resistance or nonviolent civil disobedience that we're going to see that Dr. Martin Luther King is going to have. Here in Florida, later on, you're going to see we have our own unique version of this with a wade-in. In Florida, we also had our sit-ins. And one thing that for Florida that we had that was a little different than many other southern states, for the most part, we did have some cooperation by our governors, and in this case, we have for university. As in Tallahassee, we will have Florida State and North Carolina and FAMU students that were side by side doing the sit-ins. Now, Brown versus Board of Education was in 1954, and in 1957, Orville Falvis will try to stop when Little Rock Central High School in Arkansas is going to integrate. He sends in the National Guard to keep the black students out. But Eisenhower will enforce what the courts had said in Brown versus Board of Education. Being the commander-in-chief, he then took command of the National Guard and ordered them to uphold the federal authority, which was to then protect the black students as then the school was integrated. The 9 students that came in were known as the Little Rock 9 here, as they were the first ones, and the National Guard had to stay there for a bit of time to protect them. But this is where we're going to see this happen in various places. As a lot of places, it was not a peaceful transition as we will integrate the schools. All right, I mentioned that for the Woolworth sit-in. In 1961, we will have the Freedom Riders. Now, this I know is just a little part of the notes. This is a major thing, and this is where we're going to see the power of television. You see that picture of the bus that was on fire. We will have it where these many students, but they're not all students, but a lot of them will come down to the South, and they will be attacked at bus stops. And then the case of that, you see that bus, we had buses that were firebombed, people that were killed. And as this got publicized on TV, and later on we're going to have police that are using fire hoses and attack dogs on peaceful protesters. There are people that are up north that a lot of times had ignored things and said, well, that's just something that happens down south. Many of them looked and said, this is my own country. Meanwhile, in the South, where a lot of people had looked the other way that were white, they then had to start and decide, where are you going to be? Are you going to be on the side that attacks a bus of people that are fighting just for equality? 1962, we're going to have James Marathon enroll at Ole Miss. That's University of Mississippi. Mississippi may be the most entrenched when it came to systematic racism as well as the segregation. So where I say, why is this a big deal? Play at a university in which their mascot was the Rebels. All right, you can see where this is a major change that will occur. All right, this next court case is one that you will get in government. It takes place in Tennessee, but I usually like to describe it in Georgia because that map makes it a little bit easier to see. But it affects Florida also. What had happened was that early on, a lot of the states would go and they would set up their state legislators where every county would have one senator or one representative. And what ended up happening is the rural areas had a lot more power. And Baker versus Carr, there's Reynolds versus them, there's several other court cases, will say the doctrine that is one person, one vote. And this does make it for civil rights because a lot of the more urban areas were higher population for African Americans in the South. Now, if you see that map of Georgia, you will see the area up in the top middle of the red area. That's the population, and that's basically metro Atlanta. Half the people in the state of Georgia live in those 5 or 6 counties right around there. Meanwhile, the other half lives in the other 100-something counties, where I believe there's 107 counties in Georgia. So those 5 counties with half the people only would get a very small percentage of the votes. Here in Florida, we have 67 counties, but half the people in Florida live in Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach County. So if that's the case, we would end up with those 3 counties getting 3 votes, the other 64 counties getting 64 votes. And that way it was misrepresentation. So this is one, again, you'll go more into it in government, but it's the civil rights, but also has to do with voting and representation. All right, 1963. We're going to find 63, 64, and 65 are the height of the peaceful civil rights movement, and the one led by Dr. Martin Luther King, although not everything is peaceful here. The Birmingham marches in April will have it where we were going to have the police actions by Bull Connor with the fire hoses and the attack dogs once again being on TV. Dr. Martin Luther King is jailed, and this is where he writes the letter from a Birmingham jail, which you probably read in 11th or 10th or 9th grade in your English class. But this is where this writing that will go and emphasize this side. In June of that year will be the doorstep speech at University of Alabama, where George Wallace will give this symbolic speech of segregation now, segregation forever. Does it for the cameras there, walks away afterwards, and the first students walk in, which we'll see that scene in Forrest Gump there, where one of the students drops their notebook. But at that side, this is where George Wallace is kind of rallying, and what will later on, what we nicknamed the Dixiecrats, is in '68 he will actually win some electoral votes with the American Independent Party. But a lot of this again was symbolic for what he was doing, trying to fight the integration. June of that year, we will have the NAACP Medgar Evers that is murdered. Again, this is where, if you're a Southerner and you're seeing Bull Connors, you're seeing Medgar Evers, where are you falling as this time in history is coming in there? June of that year, John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy, will ask for a civil rights bill, but Congress will not pass it. We'll get to for what Kennedy does later on, but Kennedy does not do as much as you may think there. Congress, he does not have as much power. But his death actually will help, as I'll get to later in the notes, because after his assassination, then President Johnson will use that Kennedy wanted the civil rights bill and kind of guilt Congress into making sure that they vote for it there. August of that year will be the famous I Have a Dream speech and the March on Washington, where over 250,000 African Americans and others will go and fight for freedom. So here's some pictures of it. Again, most of you know of the I Have the Dream speech that was made. And again, here's where we get to that kind of that building up of things. So in 1964, this will be a major year for changes legally. The 24th Amendment will pass 3/4 of the state. It will outlaw poll taxes, which was one of the limitations that was done to try to stop African Americans from voting there. The Civil Rights Act will be passed by President Johnson. Now, this will outlaw segregation that is by law, or what is known as de jure segregation, which is what the South had with the Jim Crow laws here. So it will be outlawed. Now, the thing that you look at, you say, well, didn't Brown do that there? No, Brown versus Board did so in public facilities, so government things. So this is where it will declare it then in private businesses. Later that same year, this will be upheld in the Heart of Atlanta Motel versus United States. In this case, this is where this hotel sued and said that the government cannot tell them that they are not allowed to segregate, but using the Interstate Commerce Clause there, which the courts will rule that no, they can, because travelers are interstate commerce. They will expand it, saying restaurants, because food could be interstate commerce. So not everything, but this is where a lot of private things then would have to make sure that they cannot legally segregate. During this year also then, Martin Luther King wins the Nobel Peace Prize in here. That summer, we will have thousands and thousands of students from the North come to South and help register voters. And for many voters, 1964 will be the first time that they're able to vote in an election. Some of it will be 68. University of Michigan there, because there were thousands of Wolverines in particular that came. Early in 1965, we will have the Selma March. there. This garners national attention as once again we have the attacks on the people marching, what became known as Bloody Sunday. In some ways, this is where, I know I've read that some historians said, this is where for a Southerner, where I've mentioned where you're going to stand. By that time, if you were a white Southerner, where are you standing in the line of history in here? And this is where the idea that comes about. And many of the white Southerners said, no, we need to go. And they join in with it. Not all here, but this is where that tide over the early 60s will change. In 65, the Voting Rights Acts will be passed. It will eliminate many barriers to voting, in particular the literacy test that was done. It'll have monitors to have areas that were known to suppress the vote in the South as well as other areas, not just in the South. And again, this is where I said for 63, 65, height of the civil rights movement, this is where legal segregation will be ended, a lot of the voting barriers there. And a lot of things, if you see in a short period of time, things had improved in the South. They definitely were not fixed all around, but legally, the legal side seemed to have been changed a lot. But what was happening in the North was another question that we have here. In northern cities, a lot of African Americans feel like they were being left behind because they did not have, again, that by law, de jure segregation. What they had was what was known as de facto or by custom. And we're going to see that we have a lot of urban riots, mainly in northern and western cities, not in the deep South. Harlem in New York City, Watson in Los Angeles, and we're going to have 43 riots in 66, major ones in 67, probably the biggest one known as Detroit. 68, we will have over 60 cities riot, again, mainly in the north. And so this is where when looking and saying, well, what is the problem? And this might sound real familiar because you're saying, wait, this is over 50 years later, and their main problems were white flight, but redlining, police brutality, pretty much the systematic racism that was built in. The white flight had made it where the schools had lost their funding, the police department. So they did in the 50s and the 60s, as whites moved to the middle class areas of the suburbs, the inner cities had lost their funding and their resources, so they did not have as much. I'm going to go over redlining, which was not by law, but this was a systematic way to try to make sure that you did not have some of the mixing of races in neighborhoods. And police brutality, again, major problem at that time. So in 1968, we will pass the Civil Rights Act. This, where the 64 Civil Rights Act was to aim for de jure and the Jim Crow laws, and pretty much you look at for the South, the Civil Rights Act of 68 was aimed a lot for the northern discrimination and the de facto segregation, and in particular in there with the housing. Now, what redlining was is they did not have official segregation. But if you were looking for a home at that time, and usually you would go to a real estate agent there, real estate agents wouldn't show immigrants and African Americans and different people, different ethnic groups, certain neighborhoods. And if for some reason or another they did find a home and you tried to apply for a mortgage, the banks wouldn't allow them in those areas. So we ended up with a lot of segregation without actually it being by law. Again, this is where different people weren't selling to them in that area. So, all right, and in the late 60s, the civil rights movement for African Americans will turn violent. And this is where I've already mentioned the urban riots. We're going to have the idea of some groups saying we need to have a separate nation. We're going to have others that say they need to have reparations because the backbone of the United States was built on the back of slaves. So the descendants of those slaves should be paid for what they had here. And so we're going to have various groups that come about in here. Now, Nation of Islam, Black Panthers, Black Power, a lot of times they get thrown together. They are not the same. The Nation of Islam, Malcolm X is the most famous, even though Elijah Muhammad had earlier. And this is one that will sometimes promote violence, same as the Black Panthers. Some of the urban riots were seen as this. Malcolm Little, or he took the name X because Little was his great-grandfather's slave master, so he did not know what his last name was, so that's why he used the name X. When he took a pilgrimage to Mecca, he found that Islam is a peaceful religion. When he came back and he was preaching then more on the side that no, we shouldn't be violent, he was assassinated there. The Black Panthers, and this is where they were ones that if we're not going to be listening, we'll use unconventional participation, and then we will have the riots. State of California under then Governor Ronald Reagan will actually pass stricter gun laws because of the Black Panther Party and where the guns they were openly carrying there. Now, Black Power is not a violent movement, but a lot of times this is kind of a, thrown in here with him. Stokely Carmichael, the idea of the raised fist, and the idea of racial pride. In 1968, we also had James Brown come out with a song, "I'm Black and I'm Proud," and this was something that was just so different than what we had before, because the idea before was not racial pride. That you were second-class citizens, and so this idea and then coming up, which frankly scared a lot of whites, both in the North and in the South, and this idea that we have. And this is where we kind of study in government why is it that they're violent? Because a lot of times when the peaceful side will not make changes, and this is where in these northern cities where again they did not have Jim Crow by law, so this is where some of the changes weren't done until they had the negative side that we had. All right, for Florida, we have both sides. During World War II, we will have a very high percentage of our soldiers that are fighting in the Double V campaign, the idea that we have victory over fascism, but also victory here in the United States when it comes to equality. Where I was talking about with the sit-ins before, that we have FAMU and FSU students together. But for Florida, we will have wade-ins. What a wade-in is, and you see some of the pictures there below that, like one of them that's down in Dade County there for Virginia Beach there, but we'll have white beaches. So blacks will go to these white beaches and they'll get arrested for being on a white beach. So it's much like a sit-in, but a very Florida taste to it. One thing that was different for Florida compared to most of the Deep South, and Florida at that time was not only geographically southern, but we were a very southern state in the attitudes here. But we had two governors, Leroy Collins and Reuben Askew, that were not like George Wallace or Orville Falvis there. And so we had a lot more cooperation. So that was a positive side that we have in the state of Florida. Meanwhile, we did have a lot of resistance to integration. Before Baker versus Carr got implemented, we definitely had this what was called the pork chop gang, which the North Central Florida had undue influence, and including a state senator from here in Citrus County. So kind of that Dixiecrats ideas that they did things politically trying to stop integration inside the state of Florida. Where I showed the video with Mr. Betts, and we see that Martin Luther King, where his house was firebombed. We will have the leader of the Florida NAACP there that's killed, Harry T. Moore, at University of Florida today. If you go there, there's the Harry T. Moore Center, which studies then racial history in Florida, where most of our universities were pretty free with things. The University of Florida itself was not denying people, but their law school had denied Virgil Hawkins for many years. Even though he had the test scores, they were denying him to go to the law school here. Once again, this is where I was about. This is where some of the wade-ins that we have down in South Florida. Also in Jacksonville, we will have some of the beaches there. This last summer, we had some things where University of Florida had where they changed, where they took away the cheer. If you're not a Gator, you're Gator bait, which some of this goes back to some of the racial overtones of the 1960s. It doesn't mean that that's where everything was this year, but there were some signs of it where you see like the fan of a Gator bait with young black children that are there. But University of Florida with some of the things their band was doing. All right, for our women's movement, this is a lot of times called the third feminist movement. Our first feminist movement was in the 1840s. The second feminist movement will be in the early 1900s, fighting for suffrage. The third feminist movement will be in the post-World War II area. What it gained a lot of strength for it will be Betty Friedan will write a book, The Feminine Mystique. And next page I'll show you a picture that the front of the cover actually tells what the book's about, because you'll see this family, but the woman's face is all blurred out. Because the idea of the book was a woman that really didn't belong, wasn't a real person there, because what a woman was supposed to do in the 50s was to be a housewife, have children, cook meals, and didn't have that. So this will launch what will be the National Organization for Women. They're going to fight for a lot of legislation. The ERA will be one thing they will push for. It does not pass the required number of states. We went a little bit in this in the 20s when it was first introduced. What happens in the 70s, it doesn't get the 3/4 of the states, because at that time, even though it will say constitutionally that men and women are equal, women would actually have lost some of their rights. And in particular, during that time period, we think about Vietnam, where women were not drafted, they would have been drafted. So that was a key on a lot of minds. But they got the Equal Pay Act for people in government jobs will have equal pay. Roe versus Wade, we're going to go more into the case in class, but this is where it will make it where some states had legalized abortion, some didn't. It will make it where states were to legalize abortions in the first 3 months, the first trimester. We'll go over where the different trimesters are and how the differences are for different states, and where some of the things are different today. Mainly you look and see where in 1973, if a baby was born 3 months premature, medically did not really have a chance. Today there is. So that second trimester is something that is looked at a lot on the legal side today. Title IX was passed in 1973, which for those of you in sports, you have lived with that, and you've seen some of the effects of it, where we make sure. I told stories about how, less than 25 years ago, I was coaching in Dunellen, and our girls softball team at that time, we played the JV games after the varsity because the softball field did not have lights. Meanwhile, once our game ended because it was dark, the lights would flip on in the baseball field. And here at Citrus High School, they got lights after Dunellen did, because we got it at that time in the mid-1990s. So this is where, even though it was passed in 73, a lot of that equality side did not go until later on. This is where I was mentioning about the book cover. You see where the woman's face there, and that's kind of what the idea of the Feminine Mystique was about. We're going to go over some of the women. This is just a real brief of some of the first. And when you see the term glass ceiling, a glass ceiling is not an official rule, but it is something there that we don't say a woman can't be president, but whoever will be the first will break that glass ceiling. Sandra Day O'Connor was our first female Supreme Court Justice, who was appointed by Ronald Reagan. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was our second, appointed by Bill Clinton. Some of you, that name should sound familiar because she recently passed away. We currently have our third, fourth, and fifth Supreme Court Justices that are female, so 3 of the 9 are. Think back to that time period and where astronauts were revered, and so Sally Ride, who will be the first female astronaut. 1984, we will have the first woman that is put on a major party ticket, as Geraldine Ferraro will be the vice presidential candidate for the Democrats. We will have in 2008, Sarah Palin for the Republicans will be the second woman as a vice president. In 2016, we will have the first woman candidate for president on a major party ticket with Hillary Clinton there. So those are ones that have broke that glass ceiling there. Not all changes were made. You see here, even it was 1972 before a Boston Marathon will allow for women to participate. All right, we're going to have other movements, and these movements will end up joining together. We will have in 68 and 69 a gay club in New York City, the Stonewall Club, where patrons had been were not being protected as they left, and they were being beat up by people. They went out. They will then establish what will be the Gay Liberation Front there, and there will be where a lot of times you kind of think of the LGBTQ community and what's happened the last month. It's a lot, or last decade or so. Some people think that has just been something recent, but no. In the late 60s, early 70s, there was a lot of changes that were made and progress made. Some of those got slowed down in the 1980s as a backlash to AIDS, and we'll kind of go over that when we get to the 80s and AIDS. But this is where, even some point of that, even the mid 70s, that homosexuality will be listed as a mental illness there. For our environmental movement, another book you need to know is Silent Spring. Rachel Carson will write this book. She will tell about how DDT, that insecticide, will have a lot of side effects, killing birds in particular, we will know with the bald eagles. And this will inspire the environmental movement, and where you may again think the last decade, no, this was in the late 60s and early 70s that we will have. And the Clean Air Acts, the Clean Water Acts, those signed by President Nixon there, and the starting of the EPA. It's not going to be immediate, but if you were to see pictures of the late 60s, early 70s of Cleveland, Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, they look a lot like how Chinese cities look today with that massive amount of pollution there. When I was growing up, our major concern was acid rain there, because there was just so much with what was coming out. And the Clean Air Act will, over decades, will make a lot of the changes that we have. Cleveland, there was always jokes about Cleveland when their lake and the river would catch on fire in there because there was so much pollution in there. So a lot of that movement that took place at that time. For Hispanics there, we lump them all together, and that's kind of one of the problems that we have in America is we have multiple different groups. So they did not have quite the organization of African Americans. We do have Cesar Chavez that will lead boycotts for Mexican American farm workers. We will have Americans that will join in with the boycott and not buy like tomatoes until they were able to raise the price. In the 80s, will be a lot for bilingual education. We will get more in the 90s and in the last 25 years where there's a lot more of what was changed for Hispanics, and also where, again, it's a lot of different groups where many times we lump them together. Here in Florida, we definitely know if you're in Miami, where we have our Cuban population, our people that are from Venezuela and Colombia, Guatemalan, besides Mexican American and Puerto Rican that you have. The Native Americans, the AIM movement will be peaceful, but they will also have some militant actions, like they will take hostages at the Indian Bureau, they will occupy the former battle site of Wounded Knee and Alcatraz, and they will win a lot of the rights, and pretty much our last group to truly be given the right to vote. And in America, were our first Americans that we had. Also, this is a time period where the Seminole Indians will sue and will be one of the only tribes to win a lawsuit for where their land was taken from them. And I explained that story in class where they set it up then as a corporation. Now, what emerges in the late 60s? We will have what is called the New Left. Now, we haven't gone over the anti-Vietnam and anti-war groups, and the free speech movement is one of groups that were fighting for more of their rights against government, in many ways, their own freedoms. But you see the feminists, the civil rights groups, environmentalists, gay liberation groups, they will join together for this New Left and this coalition, which, if you see, we still have a lot of that coalition, and in recent elections there that tend to support the Democratic Party. There does not mean that they all agree on everything, but this is where a lot of times they come together, where we're going to have a neoconservatives, we're going to have a different group in there for the new right that's going to emerge against them. Now, 1968 election, there will be a backlash and start with some of that against this new left. They're not all violent. In fact, most of them are not. But this is where we will have the assassination of Robert Kennedy. We have the assassination of Martin Luther King in '68. The Democratic National Convention starts out and indoors, beautiful Aretha Franklin singing the national anthem, but outside you will have the Chicago police and other, we'll just call them security, that were there that were for protesters, just beating the heck out of them. You see the picture down on the bottom right side. And this is where Richard Nixon will use this and this chaos that you have and will campaign, and one of his two slogans is Law and Order Man. His other slogan involves Vietnam with peace with honor. Those of you that sounds familiar, Donald Trump will also use that slogan of Law and Order Man. And again, you kind of see some of the things today where we have peaceful protests, like after George Floyd, but there were some that weren't peaceful. And so this is where the idea that trying to lump all of them in as one group that you have. During the 60s, but mainly the 70s and the 80s, we will have this conservative reaction in there. And what are called the new conservatives. They'll be more pro-family. And here Richard Nixon will speak of the silent majority. Donald Trump also spoke of the silent majority, that the majority of the people are not for all of this extreme side that we have in here. We will also have on the political side, we will have in the 1980s, the moral majority and the Christian coalition, which evangelical Christians will get involved. And actually following a lot of the ideas that the black churches of the 50s and the 60s, we will have our white evangelicals that will become very involved in politics. And this is where it was one of the strongest groups for Donald Trump here in recent years. Now, for Ronald Reagan, when you're in government, you will learn about judicial federalism. And one way that he changed a lot of things was to be a lot more partisan in his appointees that he had to the courts. And we will find after that time that both Republicans and Democrats will do that in here. And we saw in our recent presidents that both Obama and Trump will be a lot more partisan. And what's happened is we have a court that is a lot more split on ideological issues. All right, this last part in here, I made it a little bit smaller than what I've had in the past. And part of the reason is one of the most confusing court cases is Regents of University of California versus Bach. There is confusing, but we also have a lot of court cases in recent years that are kind of taking away some of this. So this is where you need to know the basic vocabulary of it. Affirmative actions were established in the 60s and the 70s. The idea was to help historic minorities. I use the word historic because even though women are a majority of the population, they are a historic minority. So what it means by that is if you had a woman and a man that were equal, the man normally got the job there. Even if they weren't equal then the man still usually got the job. Affirmative action programs were not meant for having quotas, but that will be a negative side effect that some places will use quotas there. The idea was if all things are equal, the minority would get it. So if a man and a woman then were equal, then that the woman would get the job. If it was an African American and a white, the African American would get that. But if the other person has more experience or more education or more qualified for the job, you're not supposed to hire the minority just to hire them. But what some companies did was to hire, and I gave the example here, we'll use our Duke Energy. If they were to hire someone and to try to make sure and use a quota just in case there was some sort of lawsuit, they have numbers on their side. Now, the Supreme Court case there of the Regents for California versus Bach. Bach was sued because he was not admitted to medical school, even though his test scores were higher than some African Americans and Hispanics. What has happened was the medical school had set aside a certain number of seats for various groups, which is a quota there. The court case ruled that a university could not use quotas. But what made it confusing is they said you could consider race. And this is where, like, we have some cases coming through. It's actually in California where a lot of Asian students are suing, saying they have a reverse discrimination today because they are not being admitted while whites, blacks, and Hispanics with lower test scores are being admitted because some of the universities did not want to become too Asian. And so this is where, and we see the reverse discrimination. A lot of white males will then claim that they have reverse discrimination here. Some places are trying to, and they want to be diversified. So yes, they may be doing it. And this is where for some universities that they still, even though they don't have a quota, they want to make sure that they have a more diversification here. State of Florida, we have what is called the top 20. Former Governor Jeb Bush will establish that where if you come from a Florida public school, graduated in the top 20 of your class, then you're guaranteed a spot in a Florida university. Not one of your choice, but a Florida university there. The idea was there is a lot of times our SAT and ACT are very biased. So if you came from a school like Miami Central High or someplace that has a very high percentage of minorities, then if you are graduating near the top of your class there, you have that opportunity. Part of a lot of the court cases that are coming through now are not looking so much at race, but what are the things for the finances behind it and your opportunities that you have. Because you may be an African American, but if you grow in an affluent neighborhood or middle class neighborhood, there you may have advantages. It's not just because of race there. So that is where a lot of the court cases, and that's why I say that a lot of this is in the next year or two or three in the Supreme Court. We could see some decisions coming down the line that will be making a difference with this.